Coming back to you, Pallavi, so we remember that Rahul Gandhi faced massive backlash for the comments he made in the UK on Indian democracy. And as per reports, his aide Praveen Chakravarti had claimed that Indian democracy is not on the agenda of his visit to US this time. But despite that, we are seeing such statements coming in from the United States made by Rahul Gandhi.
Yeah, but I think Sam Pitroda is the one who heads the IOC, had made it very clear, and this is the point that they have been raising. And look, that the whole purpose of Rahul Gandhi's overseas trips is essentially to bring an awareness among his supporters abroad, and to make the point that, things are not going right as far as the country is concerned. Over the next few days, he's going to have visits with NRI, celebrities. There are going to be politicians as well, their think tank, a large number of young students and professionals, so on and so forth. And the core of his meeting is essentially going to be this, that while the Congress party believes in a politics of taking everyone along, but as far as the BJP plus the RSS or the central government in India is concerned, it is essentially got to do with being very selective, that there is a lack of democracy. And I'm sure at some point of time he's likely to raise the issue of parliament. He did briefly touch upon it today about the new parliament building. In fact, in his short speech today, he took a lot of pot shots at the Prime Minister, saying that, he stopped listening to people. And when you stop listening to people, it essentially shows that you stop learning, feeling the pulse of the people, and that you're mediocre in nature.
Also, Pallavi, Rahul Gandhi has also said that it is important to have a caste census. It is a much needed thing in India right now, and he has claimed that if Congress comes to power, this is the first thing that they'll be doing.
Well, that has been the official line of the Congress party. And why does the Congress party, all their allies as well? I mean, the JDU, for example, we know the RJD has said it. And many of the other opposition political parties believe in a caste census because they feel that the real picture really needs to come out, because the kind of census we have till now doesn't reflect the changing caste combinations. And I think the electoral slogan of the Congress party for 2024 is kind of very clear. They focus on OBCs, on the Dalits, the backwards, that is, and also to paint the BJP as a party which is anti-backwards, which is the reason why the Congress party made this an issue, that why is it that the President of India, who also belongs to the backward tribal or Adivasi community, was given a miss, and the Prime Minister wanted to hog the entire show as far as the inauguration.
Namaskar and a very warm welcome. You're watching Vantage. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Washington and Beijing have been involved in an aerial confrontation. The face-off happened in the South China Sea. We'll also show you the video. The United States has called the Chinese hostility an unnecessarily aggressive maneuver. Also, Ukraine is marking a new phase in the war by pressurizing Putin. That too, using psychological warfare. But how far that's worked for Kiev's counteroffensive? We'll decode for you tonight. Also on the show, Nepal's Prime Minister is in New Delhi trying to mend fences. We'll tell you what's cooking. There's a new twist in the hunt for the Wuhan virus origins. A top Chinese scientist says a lab leak cannot be ruled out. And finally, we'll tell you all about an airline's plan to weigh their passengers before they fly. Those stories and more coming up ahead. I'm Akanksha Swaroop, filling in for Palki Sharma. Here are tonight's headlines. Sudan's army suspends truce talks with the paramilitary forces. This comes just a day after US and Saudi mediators said the truce was extended by 5 days. Fighting continues in capital Khartoum and in the flashpoint western region of Darfur. Ukraine wants EU says the ban on its grain export is helping Putin. Many of its neighbors, including staunch ally Poland, have imposed curbs on Kiev's agricultural products. The restrictions were in response to protests by farmers in some EU countries after a slump in prices. Russia backs law to ban sex reassignment. A proposed law will make sex change surgeries illegal. Last year, Russia toughened its so-called gay propaganda law, banning positive references to LGBTQ relationships. AI turns speechwriter for the Danish Prime Minister. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen delivers a speech in Parliament partly written by ChatGPT. The aim was to highlight the benefits and risks of artificial intelligence. And bad news for Elon Musk. Twitter is now worth just 1/3 of what he paid for the social media platform. That's according to financial services giant Fidelity. Musk, the world's second richest person, paid $44 billion for Twitter when he bought it last year. United States and China are on a dangerous path. Their relationship has hit rock bottom. There's a growing risk of a conflict. For months, experts have imagined the possibilities. Today, we saw it for ourselves. There was an aerial confrontation. Look at this video. This was shot inside a US reconnaissance aircraft. It was flying over South China Sea. The plane was tracking a Chinese jet. It appeared in front of them. The Americans shot a video from the plane's cockpit. Look at what happened next. Did you see that? The Chinese jet came so close, it shook the American aircraft. Can you see the pilots shaking in their seats? That is turbulence. Do you know how close the Chinese plane was? Barely 400 feet from the nose of the American plane. When did this happen? Last week on 26th May. The United States has called out China. They say this was an unnecessarily aggressive maneuver. Indeed, it was. Why did the Chinese do this? There can be only one explanation. They were trying to scare off the Americans. And this is not the first time. We've seen similar situations before when Chinese planes have tried to intercept their rivals. But they're becoming more frequent now, and there's no initiative so far to dial down the tensions. Why do I say that? Let me explain. Here's where this face-off happened, the South China Sea. We did not know the exact area, but both planes were operating here. The South China Sea is one of the biggest flashpoints. There's a huge fight for control over these waters. On one side is China. It claims control over almost the entire South China Sea. And in recent years, China has been getting aggressive there. The PLA has been trying to assert control. They have seized reefs, set up small military installations. The PLA has stepped up patrols. They have chased off non-Chinese ships. It's a massive effort to dominate the region at large. Who's on the other side of this? There are 5 regional players: Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. They have competing but sometimes overlapping claims. They have America on their side together. They reject China's claims. The US has deployed military resources, deepened military ties with regional players, and backed mediation efforts to end the dispute. What is America's interest? It wants freedom of navigation in these waters. It wants international law to prevail. But don't think this is a fight for ideals. Economic interests worth trillions of dollars are at stake. The biggest asset of this region are the trade routes. Going by some estimates, goods worth $5.3 trillion transits through South China Sea in a year. This is about 30% of the global maritime trade. $1.3 trillion worth of trade is with America alone. That's what is at risk for the US. And there's more. This region has a wealth of natural resources, 11 billion barrels of oil, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. These reserves are more than what the world's biggest energy exporters have today. There's a lucrative stockpile of fisheries too. How much are we talking? 10% of the world's total. That's why so many players are vying for control over these waters. Freedom of movement is just one aspect. At the end of the day, this is about securing the natural resources. The US wants to thwart China's ambitions. The Pentagon remains undeterred. It says it will keep flying in the region. There are plans to lodge a diplomatic protest over what happened last week. China has hit back. It says the US is violating China's sovereignty. Listen to what Beijing said, and I quote, "China will continue to take necessary measures to safeguard its security and sovereignty."
For a long time, the United States has frequently sent warships and planes to conduct close-in reconnaissance against China, which has seriously endangered China's national sovereignty and security. Such provocative and dangerous actions are the root cause of maritime security issues.
Well, no one accepts China's sweeping claims over South China Sea. So don't expect the US or its allies to back down. The tensions will prevail. And in the absence of dialogue, there's a higher chance of an escalation. The US has tried to break the ice. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is traveling. He's visiting Japan, Singapore, and India. Austin wanted to meet his Chinese counterpart during the trip, but Beijing turned down the invite. So there is no possibility of a dialogue. And if the Chinese planes continue to fly recklessly, expect more high-risk encounters. Russia is under attack again. Yesterday, Moscow was struck by drones. Today, a refinery has been targeted. This one in Russia's Krasnodar region. Pictures showed a fire engulfing the refinery. It was later put out by the local authorities. Casualties? None so far. But what caused this fire? Russia is blaming Ukraine. They say Kyiv launched a drone strike on the refinery. And that's just one attack. A separate one was reported in the Belgorod region. That one killed at least one Russian citizen. Again, Ukraine has been blamed. But how credible are these allegations? Kyiv has been silent so far. Russia has repeatedly blamed them for attacks inside Russian territory. But every time Kyiv has denied it, perhaps it's Ukraine's strategy to avoid escalation. Or maybe Russia is bluffing. Either way, the frequency of these attacks are growing. We've seen drones over Moscow, railway sabotages, bridges being blown up, and multiple refineries being targeted. The Russian president has reacted to these incidents. He says there are terror attacks.
As you know, the Kyiv regime has chosen a different path. The path of attempts to intimidate Russia, Russian citizens, and attacks on residential buildings. This is, of course, a clear sign of terrorist activities. First, I want to say that the Moscow air defense system worked in the regular way, although there are things for us to work on.
There are many ways to look at this. From Ukraine's perspective, these attacks give them more leverage. It puts fear in the mind of Russian citizens, which means indirect pressure on Moscow. From Russia's perspective, it's the perfect excuse. They can just say, look, Ukraine is attacking us, so we are escalating. But which of these is true? I'm afraid it's impossible to know because, as they say, truth is the first casualty of war. For the moment, let's assume Kyiv is behind these attacks. Do they have Western blessings for it? That's the tricky part. The US and Britain seem to have different policies. The White House says, don't attack Russia. The UK says, by all means. Listen to this.
Look, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. That's it, period. I mean, I cannot be any more clear than what I just stated. We do not support attacks inside of Russia, period.
It does also have the right to project force beyond its borders to undermine Russia's ability to project force into Ukraine itself. So legitimate military targets beyond its own border are part of Ukraine's self-defense.
So where does that leave Ukraine? In a bit of a pickle. President Zelensky is trying out a very delicate balancing act. Publicly, he says this is a defensive war, a war that has been forced upon Ukraine. But privately, he wants more aggressive tactics. That's what leaked documents from the Pentagon show. 3 audacious missions stand out. Zelensky wanted to occupy Russian border villages. He wanted to strike a pipeline carrying Russian oil to Hungary. And he wanted long-range missiles to hit Russian targets. NATO has given him long-range missiles. But that supply came on one condition, that those missiles will be used for defense and not offense. So far, the promise has been kept. Long-range missiles have not been used to hit Russian targets. Instead, we have seen unconventional methods, like Russian militias aligned to Ukraine or low-cost drones. There's logic to using these methods. You see, Russia's air defenses are designed to deter missiles. But low-flying drones, not so much. Listen in to this expert.
Russian air defenses, particularly around Moscow, are oriented on a different kind of threat. They are oriented on missiles, ballistic missiles, regional missiles, aircraft, bombers, but not short-range drones, which might be flying very low over the ground, for example. The Russians have been focused on the United States and what it could do, and not on what one of its neighbors might do with these relatively short-range drones.
That could be one reason. The idea of these attacks isn't to overpower Russia. That's virtually impossible. The idea is to put pressure on Putin, to make Russian citizens feel insecure and hence raise their voice. But is it working? Well, yes and no. The attacks have caught the Wagner Group's attention. Their chief is blaming the Russian Defense Ministry once again in colorful language. Listen in.
The fact that they fly to Rubliovka, to your home, the hell with it, let your houses burn. And what do ordinary people do when drones with explosives crash into their windows? And therefore, as a citizen, I'm deeply indignant.
So there has been an impact, but not like mass paranoia. We're not seeing Russian citizens flooding bomb shelters, and that's the downside. Russia could use these attacks to step up the fighting. We are already seeing evidence of that. The city of Kiev was attacked thrice in 24 hours this week. So in conclusion, let me say this. The attacks inside Russia represent a new phase of this war. This time, Ukraine is making the moves and Russia is on the receiving end. But how long will Putin let that slide? We'll find out soon enough. And here's something that Putin won't let slide for sure: NATO's expansion plans. The military alliance is conducting drills in the Arctic with a vow to protect their newest member, Finland. Alongside the drills, there's now a renewed push for Sweden's membership. Sweden had filed its application along with Finland last year, but they haven't been able to get through the finish line. Our next report tells you how Russia is responding.
NATO has a new battleground to flex its muscles: the Arctic. With Finland joining the military alliance, the NATO's borders with Russia have now doubled. That's why over 1,000 troops have gathered here. They're conducting military drills. These exercises have a clear objective. They are a demonstration of NATO's commitment to collective defense. So, if Finland comes under attack, all other 30 members will join forces to defend it.
The U.S. Army is here training with our newest NATO ally to build that capability to help defend Finland if anything happens. That's our commitment to them.
Sweden wants the same privileges. It applied to join the NATO last year. Everyone is on board except for one, Turkey. Hungary too is yet to ratify Sweden's accession, but Turkey is seen as the main stumbling block. What are Ankara's objections? It's demanding action against the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Turkey calls it a terrorist group and accuses Sweden of harboring it. The United States is in no mood to wait anymore. This week, it decided to send a message.
We urge both Turkey and Hungary, which is also not yet ratified, to ratify the accession as quickly as possible. There is no reason for any further time. Sweden is ready now. That decision should move forward now.
There is talk of a deal. Biden spoke to Erdogan recently. He hinted at a quid pro quo: American F-16 jets in exchange for Sweden's accession.
He congratulated Erdogan, and he still wants to work on something on the F-15s. I told him we wanted to deal with Sweden until I get that done.
So the US is keen on cracking a deal. It's only a matter of time. But the bid to expand NATO comes at a sensitive time. Tensions are growing in Kosovo. The divided town of Zvecan is the flashpoint, where Serbs have engaged in fierce clashes with NATO peacekeepers. At least 30 soldiers were injured in the violence. Ethnic tensions have flared up again. Public anger erupted after ethnic Albanian mayors took office in Zvecan. This is an area dominated by ethnic Serbs. They had boycotted the elections in April. This allowed ethnic Albanians to take power. Today, they gathered again to demand the removal of a mayor. Dozens of protesters assembled outside a government building as the NATO troops stood behind barbed wires and watched. Russia has weighed in. It holds the NATO troops responsible for the flare-up.
A large eruption is brewing up in the center of Europe, in the very place where in 1999 NATO carried out an aggression against Yugoslavia, violating all possible principles of Helsinki Accords and other OSCE documents. The situation is alarming, but the West made total suppression of everyone who voices their own opinion about its policy.
The conflict in Kosovo dates back to the 1990s when Albanians rebelled against Serbia's rule. It led to a brutal crackdown. About 13,000 Albanians died. That's when NATO entered the region. A military intervention forced Serbia to pull out. Kosovo declared its independence in 2008. While ethnic Albanians make up more than 90% of the population in Kosovo, the Serbs dominate the north, which is why thousands of NATO forces are still in the region, and they now have the challenge to restore peace. The NATO is deploying more troops.
We have decided to deploy 700 more troops from the Operational Reserve Force for Western Balkans, and to put an additional battalion of reserve forces on higher readiness so they can also be deployed if needed.
European leaders are calling for a de-escalation. With tensions brewing on the front lines with Russia, the region can ill afford a conflict right at the center of the continent.
We talked about the Ukraine war. It has led to the displacement of millions. Around 8 million Ukrainians have crossed over to Europe. No hassles, no delays. They were welcomed with open arms. Now compare that to Afghan refugees. Tens of thousands of them have reached the EU borders. They are awaiting resettlement, but I'm afraid it's an endless wait. Let me tell you what an international charity has found. Around 270,000 Afghans need permanent protection, meaning resettlement. Guess how many actually got it in 2022? Just 271. We did the math. That's 0.1% of the Afghans who needed resettlement. So much for Europe's open arms. Only 271 out of 270,000 Afghans have been resettled. And the rest? Well, they are living in camps on Greek islands. Quick side note, Greece is often called the gateway to Europe. It's the assembly point for most refugees, but their camps are horrible. This charity's report describes them as prison-like. It also accuses the EU of staggering neglect. In 2021, Germany set up a scheme to resettle 1,000 Afghans every month. And how many did they? 0 under that scheme. Italy has taken in half of what they promised, and some countries did not even bother. Austria refused to take in more Afghan refugees. So did Serbia and Poland. They simply shut the door. So thousands of Afghans were trapped in Greek camps. Their living conditions are bad, but their mental health is worse. Around 90% of them reported anxiety. 86% reported symptoms of depression. The obvious question is, why isn't the EU taking them in? It's not resources for sure. We just told you how Europe welcomed 8 million Ukrainians. What is 270,000 compared to that? So the only answer is racism. Europe doesn't have a problem with white European refugees, but it has a problem with Afghans. Take Poland, for example. They've done great work for Ukrainians. Around 1.3 million refugees are still living there. But let me tell you how that same Poland treated Afghans. In 2021, they trapped 32 Afghans at their border with Belarus. They refused to let them apply for asylum. Just think about it. Red carpet for 1.3 million Ukrainians, iron fence for 32 Afghans. If this isn't racism, what is? The fact is, Europe has a responsibility to these people. They had no problems marching in to Afghanistan with NATO, nor with occupying the country for 2 decades. But when it comes to refugees, they have no time or resources. So what's the solution? The EU has been asked to scale up the process. They have also given a target. Resettle at least 42,500 Afghans in the next 5 years. Ideally, it shouldn't take that long, but knowing the EU, even that target is impossible.
Because of a wheel of fear, militancy. And once that is gone, you see how this year we had nearly 1.6 or 1.7 crore tourists in Kashmir Valley. So this means the change was waiting to happen, but those at the helm either did not have the vision to carry it forward, or they had some other vested interest because they flourished in that mayhem of terrorism. So there was a group or nexus which had flourished, whether it was the polity, whether it is the trade, whether it is the
India is playing host this week. The Nepalese Prime Minister is in town. Pushp Kamal Dahal, aka Prachand, he took office in December 2022. He is the latest in Nepal's musical chair of Prime Ministers. It promises to be a very consequential visit. For starters, it's his first since taking office. Prachand had invitations from India and China, but he chose India first. That's a good sign. He also put a Chinese military deal on hold before coming here. Again, good sign. His visit to India was delayed and postponed multiple times. When asked about this, Prachand had an interesting answer. He said he was doing his homework. Prachand has come with a massive delegation, around 88 people, including ministers and businessmen. He is slated to meet India's president, vice president, and of course the Prime Minister. His meeting with Prime Minister Modi will happen tomorrow. Both sides are clear about what they want. Nepal is hoping for two things. One is a reset in ties. Nepal-India relations have been through a tough phase. Former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli claimed Indian territories by releasing a new map. This led to a diplomatic conflict of sorts. Beijing was seen cozying up to Kathmandu. But Prachand will be hoping to clean the slate, to get things back on track. Number two, he will be hoping for some deliverables, like more flights between the two countries, more trade and investments, and most importantly, permission to export electricity to Bangladesh. Both Dhaka and Kathmandu are keen. But since they don't share a border, they will have to use India's grid. Prachand will be hoping for an all clear. And what will India be hoping for? A reset would be good news for India as well. But China is the elephant in the room. New Delhi has traditionally been the chief military and economic partner for Kathmandu. Now Beijing wants in. You see, China has boosted trade and investment with Nepal. So what India wants is assurances, a promise that Nepal will put India first over China. It's a policy that is pursued towards the whole of South Asia. The Maldives, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of them. The question is, will Nepal agree? After all, Kathmandu has its own strategic considerations. It would make sense to play India and China against each other, sort of like best of both worlds. In fact, Nepal did that right up to the pandemic. But recently, there has been a rethink. Like I said, Prachand chose to visit India before China. He also put a military deal on hold. What explains this? Perhaps recent developments in the region. Just look at what happened in Sri Lanka. Chinese debt pushed the country into financial ruin. But even then, India stood by and helped. It gave assistance worth $4 billion. This has reinforced India's position as a reliable partner in South Asia. Hence, the much-hyped visit by Prachand. Having said that, there's little scope for trouble. Prachand belongs to the Communist Party of Nepal. It is considered close to Beijing. Many leaders of the party have demanded a hawkish position, like KP Sharma Oli. He wants Prachand to raise the border issue with India. Others want a review of the 1950 Friendship Treaty. Both issues will put India off. So Prachand needs to make a calculated decision. Indications are he will steer clear from controversies, maybe focus only on deliverables. If not, things could get uncomfortable. As for India, the brief is simple. Offer more support and assistance to Nepal, build stronger people-to-people ties. That last one is very important. Nepal and India do share strong cultural and religious ties, but those can't be taken for granted. Recently, Nepalese leaders have tried to drum up anti-India sentiments. KP Sharma Oli's revised map was the perfect example. To tackle that, India needs to build confidence. It needs to create a relationship based on trust and equality. We'll be tracking tomorrow's bilateral closely. Now let's go a little north and focus on China. A top Chinese scientist has made a shocking statement. He was asked about the origin of the Wuhan virus, about whether the pandemic could have started due to a lab leak. He said, and let me quote, "You can always suspect anything. That's science. Don't rule out anything." The scientist was Professor George Gao. He was the head of China's Center for Disease Control. Yes, the head of China's CDC says don't rule anything out. And apparently, the Chinese government did not. Gao says that Beijing investigated the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the possible birthplace of the Wuhan virus. It shows that Beijing was worried about the pandemic coming from a lab, despite the staunch denials to the world. So is the Chinese scientist actually going against the government by saying all this? Here's more in our report.
The Wuhan virus, a disease that led to millions of deaths. One that locked down the world. It's no longer considered a public health emergency. The world has long since opened up. But questions remain. What caused the deadly pandemic? More specifically, was the Wuhan virus a natural occurrence? Or was it engineered in a lab? Recently, more fuel was added to this burning question from an unlikely source. A top Chinese scientist, and not just any scientist, the former head of China's Center for Disease Control, Professor George Gao. When asked about the possibility of the lab leak theory being true, Gao said this, "Don't rule anything out." It's an unexpected response to say the least. Remember, the Chinese government has vehemently denied the lab leak theory. Beijing said it's nothing but slander. But Gao, a former government scientist, is telling us not to rule anything out. Has he decided to speak out, to defy Beijing? Not really. He just said, don't rule anything out. He hasn't really endorsed the theory. But he went on to say China was vigilant, that the government actually conducted an investigation into the lab under scrutiny. This is the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Gao says the lab was double-checked by the experts in the field. He added, "I think their conclusion is that they're following all the protocols. They haven't found any wrongdoings." If that's the case, why tell people not to rule anything out? Is it a criticism of the government investigation? Again, probably not. He said, you can always suspect anything. That's science. Don't rule out anything. He was talking about scientific rigor, the need for scientists to always question everything. It really proves nothing. Previous assessments say the lab leak theory is extremely unlikely and that the virus originated in a wet market in Wuhan. Of course, this is based on questionable evidence. Even the WHO didn't end up accepting their conclusions. It wants to conduct another probe that digs deeper into the early days of the pandemic in Wuhan. But China refuses to cooperate. So due to lack of other evidence, the wet market theory is the dominant one. But the wet market hypothesis isn't too much better. Remember, these markets are where all manner of animals are kept for purchase. They stacked up in unhygienic conditions, creating a toxic environment where the disease could have been born, jumping from a bat to an intermediate animal and then a human. It's the most widely accepted theory, but again, it's based on limited evidence. It can be wrong. To quote Professor Gao, don't rule anything out. But this advice has its limits, and we should be wary of its misuse. Reports say the Chinese government has come out with a third theory on origins of the Wuhan virus, a theory which takes Wuhan out of the equation. China is saying the virus was brought into the country on frozen food packaging. Yes, Beijing is passing the buck, metaphorically washing its hands off the virus. And if we were to listen to Gao's advice, we would have to consider Beijing's version to not rule it out. That sounds a bit too convenient. An unnecessary nod to an unsubstantiated theory. There's no need to believe everything Beijing says. Here, both the origin theory camps agree. No matter where in Wuhan the virus originated, it did come from the city. We can safely continue calling it the Wuhan virus.
Now let's turn our attention to North Korea. The country had planned to launch a satellite by June 11. Why? To monitor US military activities. And it tried doing so, but failed. North Korea's first space satellite crashed into the sea. But while the satellite failed to do its job, it succeeded in one thing: creating panic. The launch sparked a false alarm in the South Korean capital of Seoul. Japan also issued a warning to its residents of Okinawa. There were air raid sirens blaring, emergency messages passing around. There was chaos and confusion as people tried to save their lives, only to be told 20 minutes later that there had been an error. Our next report tells you more about it.
What you just heard were wailing air raid sirens in South Korea's Seoul and Japan's Okinawa. This was followed by mobile phone alerts. They called for evacuations, which is rare. All this happened on Wednesday morning. People awoke to the confusion. Residents were rattled. Reports say people were frantically running for cover. Some grabbed their children and hid. Others started making calls to their loved ones. Many were frantically dialing the emergency numbers. Some even went online to check what had happened, but internet was slow.
I was a little confused by the alert message this morning.
I thought it was an earthquake, but when I looked, it was a missile.
This panic and pandemonium went on for about 20 minutes, after which both Japan and South Korean governments clarified. There was no missile attack. In fact, it was a failed satellite launch by North Korea. Pyongyang had launched its first space satellite, only it was a failure, crashing into the West Sea of Korea, but it was successful in sparking a false alarm in South Korea and Japan, because both the countries were unsure about what had just happened, and they jumped to conclusions.
Today, an object that appears to be a ballistic missile was launched by North Korea.
However, both South Korea and Japan were completely wrong, and now they have apologized.
I apologize for causing confusion over Seoul City's emergency alert message on North Korea's space launch vehicle this morning. This emergency message could be a working level official's overreaction, but it was not a mistake. Our principle is to respond in a manner that can be seen as excessive, and there can be no compromise on safety.
Residents of both these countries live under constant threat, thanks to their neighbor, North Korea. North and South Korea are still technically at war, even though 7 decades have passed since the Korean War ended in an armistice. And now, Pyongyang under Kim Jong-un is amping up its aggression, especially as it plans to expand its nuclear arsenal, to apply pressure on both Washington and Seoul. But that being said, this latest move by North Korea has angered South Korea and Japan. Their citizens are upset too, not with Pyongyang, but their own governments.
How do they ensure that they can trust in their local authorities? And I feel like every time in this case, if we're talking about North Korea, every time that North Korea fires a missile of some sort, and there's possibility that it may either fly over Hokkaido or be landing within Japan's EEZ.
While people are justifiably angry over this false alarm, the threat is very real, because North Korea is clearly on a war path, and the war clouds over Japan and South Korea are looming large, and one day they may actually rain fire.
Now let's shift our focus to something threatening to kill us all: artificial intelligence. Yes, the AI tools that are going viral also have the potential to cause our extinction, almost exactly like in the Terminator movies. And we aren't the ones saying this. It's the people who created the tools. Here's a letter released by AI developers and experts yesterday. It says, and I quote, "Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war." And so, they are comparing AI to pandemics and nuclear war. Let's look at who signed it. Top of the list are Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, two of the three people considered the godfathers of artificial intelligence. Hinton quit Google earlier this month. He said it was so that he could warn people about the dangers of AI. He recently spoke about how AI could turn on humans.
If you want to go to Europe, you create the sub-goal of get to the airport. And then you solve that sub-goal. And for any complicated goal, you want to create sub-goals. And it turns out here's a very good sub-goal for almost anything you want to do. Get more control. If you get more control, it makes it easier to achieve other things. So once these things are able to create sub-goals, them being very smart, I think they will quickly realize that if they got more control, they could realize their goals much more easily. And once they want to get control, things start looking bad for people. So if you're a skilled manipulator, and these things will be extremely skilled manipulators because they'll have learned from all the manipulations people ever did. So they'll be much better than a person at manipulating us. They'll be able to manipulate us into doing whatever they want. It'll be like you manipulating a 2-year-old. So they don't need to pull levers or press buttons. The idea of air gapping them and everything will be okay isn't going to work.
Then there are the CEOs of the leading AI firms: Google, DeepMind, Anthropic, and OpenAI. Yes, even OpenAI, the firm behind ChatGPT, which arguably started the AI arms race. Even Sam Altman believes that there is a risk of extinction from AI.
If this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong. And we want to be vocal about that. We want to work with the government to prevent that from happening.
He's asking governments to get involved. He wants to work with them to stop the AI apocalypse. Altman has flip-flopped on the issue so far. Earlier, he said he didn't want too much regulation. He even threatened to pull out of Europe over upcoming AI regulation there. But then he backtracked. Now, with this signing of the extinction letter, it seems he's completely sure about the dangers of AI. Altman is traveling around the globe, meeting world leaders to discuss AI. He will meet European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen tomorrow. He's also expected to visit India next month. Speaking of India, New Delhi is also looking at the threat posed by AI. It's expected to lay out guardrails for the technology in the upcoming Digital India Act. The law is set to become public next week, but the focus is disinformation, not annihilation. It seems that the world has not grasped the scale of the danger. Politicians seem more focused on how AI can peddle disinformation, how it can cause problems in upcoming elections, which is also valid. It's already started in the US with AI-generated deepfake videos doing the rounds. But they're missing the forest for the trees. That's just one of the problems that AI brings. We think the end of the human race is the bigger issue here. Politicians need to focus on the big picture before it's too late to stop the rise of the machines. Would you want to take a flight from New Zealand? Keep your phone and keys aside, remove your shoes, and get ready to step on the scale. That's right, because New Zealand's Civil Aviation Authority is demanding a passenger weight survey. This new program will apply to Air New Zealand for passengers departing on international flights. It will begin July onwards and help the airline gather data on passenger weight. Why? So the Aviation Authority can understand weight load and distribution for planes. And this has become part of a much bigger debate. People are weighing in on this new program, and the reactions are mixed. But Air New Zealand is not the first flight to incorporate a weight survey. We tell you more about it in our next report.
Women's magazines and aircraft. Do you know what the two have in common? They both want you to watch your weight. It's true, Aircraft are obsessed with weight, so they weigh everything they carry. From cargo to meals on board to luggage. And it only makes sense that now they want to weigh their customers as well. We're talking about New Zealand. Their Civil Aviation Authority is launching a new program, a passenger weight survey. It's for passengers departing on international flights of Air New Zealand, which is the country's national airline. But why is this survey required? Are they trying to body shame you? Definitely not, says the Aviation Authority. Why then? They say it's to gather data on weight load. It'll help them distribute weight correctly overall. Air New Zealand has called this measure essential to ensure the safe and efficient operation of the aircraft. And they are right. Aircraft have always weighed everything. You already know that. This includes their crew and passengers. Just that they usually assume this weight. They call it assumed mass. It's an estimate of the total weight of the passengers. They use set figures for this. Think of it as an average number that they apply. But this is far from accurate. Airlines often use only gender to assume weight. So two passengers of the same gender will fit into the same weight average. In reality, though, there might be a big difference in their respective weights. What's more, measuring weight also has environmental benefits. Aircraft crew loads fuel based on the assumed weight. For instance, if the actual weight is less than the assumed weight, then lesser fuel will be required. So it's important to get the numbers right, which is where the survey comes in. And New Zealand knows this, because this isn't the first time they're holding this survey. Flyers on the domestic network were weighed in 2021. There were plans to weigh international flyers too, but the pandemic hit and the program was halted. Now that international travel has resumed, so can the weight measuring program. And New Zealand is not the only country to consider a weight survey. Uzbekistan did it in 2015, Finland and Hawaii in 2017. But despite the benefits of a weight survey, many are not in favor of this program. That's because weight is a personal thing. Most are not comfortable disclosing it. Stepping on scales in public can be a daunting experience. Which is why New Zealand is doing its bit to make customers feel safe. Its travelers will stand on a digital scale, which will calculate their weight and automatically submit it to the survey. The weight will not be displayed on the agent's screen, thus protecting the privacy of the passengers. Plus, it's completely voluntary. So, will the freedom of choice make it comfortable for travelers? New Zealand sure hopes so. These weighty matters can't be taken lightly. But if you do watch your weight, remember, you're lessening the load on the aircraft and the planet, quite literally.
And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Let me begin with Brazil. Clashes broke out over a bill on recognition of ancestral lands. Indigenous protesters attacked police officials with bows and arrows. Meanwhile, a pageant in Brazil became a decrowning event. The runner-up's partner snatched the crown from the winner and aggressively tossed it on the floor. And an all-private astronaut crew that had gone to the International Space Station has returned. And finally, what makes May 31st significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day in 1961, South Africa declared itself a republic. The country was a colony of Great Britain for many years. It became independent in 1931, but the British monarchy remained head of state. But today, 62 years ago, South Africa decided to cut all formal ties with Great Britain. We leave you with that. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Humble submission to Almighty God. We declare that we are conscious of our responsibility towards God and man.
Got a better view now of the recovery team. Fast boat now clearing the way for the lift.
All right, first view of our crew. Specialist.
That looks like Rayana.
Rayana Barnawi, egressing a Dragon capsule.
And all the other leading areas, and that milieu was not being provided to him because of a wheel of fear, militancy. And once that is gone, you see how this year we had nearly 1.6 or 1.7 crore tourists in Kashmir Valley. So this means the change was waiting to happen, but those at the helm either did not have the vision to carry it forward, or they had some other vested interest because they flourished in that mayhem of terrorism. So there was a group or nexus which had flourished, whether it was the polity, whether it is the trade, whether it is the industry, and the ruling dispensations, generation after generation, flourishing under the shadow of terrorism, where voting percentage would be just 10%, 12%, and they would get elected as members of parliament and members of the legislative assembly, and then go on to become chief minister and ministers from generation to generation. So all that is over now.
One criticism though, Dr. Singh, and this is my final question, that the opposition constantly raises against Mr. Modi's government is on two issues. Number one, price rise, the other, unemployment. They're saying that on both of these issues, the Modi government has not done a good job, that people are hurting. And also they've criticized the recent inauguration of the new parliament, saying that, you know, opposition leaders were not invited, the president was not invited. India is slipping away from being a democracy to some kind of electoral autocracy. How would you respond to that criticism?
No, I think these kind of accusations hardly need to be responded to, because it's opposition. It has to oppose. You cannot ask the Congress to come and pat my back and say, very well done. Otherwise, what would they contest election for? And when they say autocracy, the whole, you know why Prime Minister Modi is being looked up to by the rest of the world? Because he has been decisively elected by 140 crore people of this country. Is that autocracy? For the first time, we have a stable government. That's why the world is looking up to us. India has become a favorite destination for investment, for business, for negotiation, for diplomacy, because they see a democratically elected stable government, which is rare. We have had stable governments lasting for decades together. It could be a Marxist government, it could be a communist government, a fascist government, dictatorships, but never here. And have you seen consistently someone continuing as head of state for more than 2 decades, for 23 years? None of the prime ministers in the past have. Even Mrs. Gandhi gave up after a decade. So here we have a head of state who's been popularly elected again and again, and he has defied the principle of diminishing returns. On the contrary, with each successive election, he gets higher mandate.
Okay.
So where is the autocracy? I think it's the democracy in the best form. And then you are just now talking about Jammu and Kashmir. I think that's the best example of democracy being actually followed letter and spirit is Prime Minister Modi, who introduced grassroots democracy at the level of district development councils.
Okay.
I am sure someday the historians will ask why Jammu and Kashmir, unlike other states and union territories, had to wait for 70 long years to have a district elected district council. And mind you, it was those parties which are talking of autonomy, which are talking of self-rule. Now to you and me, if you, simple definition of democracy would be the self.
A very warm welcome. You're watching Breaking on News 18. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Let's dive into the segment with the latest coming in from the state of Manipur. Remember, the Home Minister is in the state and it is the third day of his visit. Home Minister Amit Shah will now be holding a press conference tomorrow at 11 a.m. in Imphal. That's what we are learning at the moment. But remember, 3 days have passed by and Amit Shah has ensured that all tribal leaders are pacified and that Finally, calm prevails in the state of Manipur. And when the tribal leaders laid forward their demands, this is what the Home Minister had to say. He's in fact assured them that their demands will be met. But for now, he's requested all tribal leaders to ensure that there is peace in the state for at least a fortnight before he meets the demands that were put forward by the tribal leaders. And the latest that we are now learning is that tomorrow at 11 a.m. in Imphal, Home Minister Amit Shah will be holding a press conference. There will be some significant points emerging out of that press conference. In the meantime, let's quickly go across to Arunima, who's on the phone line with me. Arunima, these 3 days have been very significant. Tell us what were the demands posed by the leaders of those tribal communities, and what has the Home Minister promised in return?
Well, there was clear demarcation once again between what the Imphal Valley wanted and what hills wanted. Right. Valley is where the Meitei community dominates. Hills are where the Kukis are. So when Home Minister visited the Kuki-dominated areas, the tribal leaders who met him asked for President's rule, asked for a separate, geographical and political state for themselves. Something that we are told Home Minister has said outright, it's not possible to bifurcate Manipur. In Imphal, the Meiteis insisted that the Kuki terrorists, as they're referring to the insurgents in the hill states, they say that the Kuki terrorists are infiltrating from the Myanmar